India is now signing trade and investment agreements with a growing number of countries across Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. This is not happening by accident. What looks like a series of separate deals is actually part of a larger shift in the global economy. These agreements are not limited to diplomacy or political symbolism. They are directly tied to manufacturing, supply chains, and long-term investment decisions. They influence where factories are built, how components move across borders, and how quickly production can recover when disruptions occur. For decades, global production revolved around a single center. China offered unmatched efficiency, scale, and speed, and the world organized itself around that reality. But the same structure also created a concentration of risk. Trade disputes, tariff threats, sanctions, and geopolitical shocks have made that risk impossible to ignore. When disruption hits one central hub, the effects spread immediately across industries and borders. What is happening now is not a rejection of China. It is a recalibration. Governments and corporations are no longer comfortable relying on one country alone. They are redesigning supply chains to include a second pillar, one that can absorb shocks without breaking the system. India is increasingly being placed in that role. This shift is already visible in concrete decisions. Trade negotiations between India and the European Union have intensified. Economic cooperation between India and Gulf countries has expanded beyond energy into manufacturing and logistics. The United States, Japan, and Australia now formally describe India as a key partner in supply chain resilience. On the corporate side, the pattern is consistent. New production capacity is being added in India, while existing operations in China remain in place. Companies are not replacing one country with another. They are building parallel structures. This raises a critical question. Why are so many countries choosing to anchor new agreements with India at this moment? To answer that, we first need to understand what changed in the global environment and why relying on a single manufacturing center no longer feels secure. For many years, China was not just the world's factory. It was also predictable. Trade rules were stable, production scaled smoothly, and geopolitical risk was treated as manageable. That perception no longer holds. The relationship between the United States and China has moved from tension to structure. It is no longer tied to a single administration or a single dispute. Tariffs introduced years ago never fully disappeared. Export controls expanded from specific technologies to entire categories of strategic goods. Sanctions became a tool that could be activated quickly when political conditions changed. For companies, this created a new kind of uncertainty. Costs can change suddenly. Access to components can be restricted without warning. Long-term planning becomes harder when policy is unpredictable. The pandemic exposed an even deeper weakness. When factories shut down in one country, production stopped everywhere. Medical supplies, electronics, industrial components all faced shortages at the same time. It was not because global demand collapsed. It was because supply was concentrated in one place. China remains a manufacturing powerhouse. Its infrastructure, workforce, and supplier networks are unmatched. But strength alone is no longer enough. What governments and corporations are reassessing is reliability. They are asking how vulnerable their systems become when one country carries too much weight. This is why the shift we see today is often misunderstood. It is not an exit from China. It is an effort to avoid a single point of failure. The goal is not to abandon efficiency, but to balance it with resilience. And that is why attention began moving beyond China alone. At that moment, among many emerging economies, one country stood out as large enough, stable enough, and politically usable as a complement. That country was India. But India did not emerge because it was the best possible alternative. It emerged because it was one of the very few options that could realistically work at scale. Among emerging economies, India is almost alone in matching China's population size, which matters because manufacturing at a global level requires not just factories, but vast numbers of workers and consumers moving together. India's domestic market is also expanding rapidly, which allows companies to produce goods not only for export, but for local consumption as well. That combination reduces risk, because demand does not disappear the moment global trade slows. Another factor is political structure. India operates under a democratic system with legal institutions that are familiar to Western governments and multinational corporations. Contracts, courts, and regulatory processes are not identical to those in Europe or the United States, but they are legible in ways that reduce uncertainty. Just as important is where India stands geopolitically. India is not fully aligned with the United States, and it is not part of China's strategic orbit either. This position allows India to function as a buffer, rather than a frontline state in great power rivalry. For governments, this reduces diplomatic risk. For companies, it lowers the chance that a factory becomes a political target overnight. This is why India is increasingly treated as a geopolitical shock absorber, a place where exposure can be expanded without locking into a single power block. Yet these conditions alone do not build supply chains or move production at scale. The more important question is what India is actually doing with this opportunity. What stands out first is that India's shift is not based on declarations or long-term promises, but on policy tools that are already reshaping investment decisions. One of the clearest examples is the Production-Linked Incentive Program, which directly rewards companies for manufacturing inside India rather than simply operating there. This has had a measurable impact, particularly in electronics, pharmaceuticals, automotive components, and renewable energy equipment, where new capacity has been announced and brought online. At the same time, India is not starting from zero. Decades of experience in IT and services have produced a large base of engineers, managers, and supply chain specialists who are used to working with global firms and international standards. That background matters because modern manufacturing depends as much on coordination and process control as it does on labor costs. Another quiet but important change is happening through digital infrastructure. Systems like UPI and the broader India stack have reduced friction in payments, identity verification, and compliance, making it easier for firms to operate across states and scale quickly. This does not eliminate bureaucracy, but it shortens timelines in ways that were not possible a decade ago. There is also a structural difference in how India competes for investment. Unlike China's centrally directed model, Indian states play a decisive role. States compete with each other on land access, tax treatment, labor rules, and permitting speed, which has pushed some regions to move faster than the national average. This unevenness creates challenges, but it also creates momentum, because successful states become models others try to copy. Taken together, these changes show that India's rise as a manufacturing and supply chain partner is already underway. But momentum is not the same as dominance, and progress does not yet place India on equal footing with China. The gap between China and India is not about speed, it is about the completeness of the manufacturing ecosystem. China operates one of the most dense and integrated supply chains ever built, where raw materials, intermediate inputs, assembly, logistics, and export infrastructure exist within tightly connected industrial clusters. In many Chinese manufacturing regions, a factory can source components, tooling, packaging, and logistics within a few hours of driving distance. That density reduces cost, shortens timelines, and allows production to scale almost instantly when demand changes. India does not yet operate at that level of integration. Much of India's manufacturing growth remains concentrated in assembly and selected intermediate stages, rather than across the full production stack. This means that even when final assembly takes place in India, critical components, machinery, and technical inputs are often imported from China or other parts of East Asia. Infrastructure constraints reinforce this gap. Power reliability, port capacity, and road connectivity have improved, but they remain uneven and region-dependent. In some states, factories can operate close to global standards, while in others, delays and outages still raise costs and uncertainty. Labor is another constraint that shapes how far India can move. India has a large workforce, but large-scale manufacturing depends not only on numbers, it requires a deep pool of experienced technicians, supervisors, and mid-level engineers who can keep complex systems running. China spent decades building this layer through repeated industrial cycles, while India is only beginning to accumulate that experience. Manufacturing growth today also looks different from the past. Modern factories can raise production and exports, but they rely on automation and specialized skills, which means they create far fewer jobs than many people expect. Taken together, these structural limits explain why companies are not abandoning China. Instead, they are adding India alongside it. India is becoming an additional node in global supply chains, not a full substitute for the system China already represents. And that is precisely why the shift we are seeing still matters. What is happening now is not a replacement of one country by another, it is a reconfiguration of how the global economy is organized. For decades, global manufacturing revolved around a single dominant center, optimized for speed, cost, and efficiency. That model delivered low prices, but it also created hidden fragilities that only became visible during shocks. As supply chains were disrupted by pandemics, trade conflicts, and geopolitical tensions, governments and companies began reassessing what resilience actually means. Instead of asking where production is cheapest, they started asking where it can continue operating under stress. This is why supply chains are no longer treated as neutral commercial systems. They are increasingly viewed as strategic assets tied to national security, economic stability, and political leverage. Trade agreements reflect this shift. They focus less on pure tariff reduction and more on rules for data, technology, sustainability, and trusted sourcing. This transition comes with costs. Building redundancy means higher expenses, slower optimization, and less price efficiency than before. Yet companies and governments are willing to accept those costs because relying on a single supply chain leaves them exposed to sudden disruption. Over time, this trade-off feeds into broader inflation dynamics, as resilience replaces maximum efficiency as the guiding principle. The global economy is not becoming simpler. It is becoming more distributed, more complex, and more politically aware. And this brings us to the most realistic outlook for what comes next. The global economy is not moving toward a future where one country replaces another at the center. China is likely to remain a core manufacturing hub for the foreseeable future, supported by decades of accumulated supply chains, infrastructure, and industrial depth. At the same time, India is steadily positioning itself as the most important strategic complement to that system. This parallel structure reflects how governments and companies now think about risk. They are no longer searching for a single new center to depend on. They are building a system where production, sourcing, and capacity are spread across multiple large anchors. In that structure, China continues to provide scale and efficiency, while India offers diversification, resilience, and long-term growth potential. The world is not returning to a single axis of manufacturing dominance. It is settling into a more distributed model, where multiple countries matter at the same time. In that model, India does not replace China, but it increasingly stands alongside it, shaping how the next phase of the global economy will function.